On a peaceful morning in the neighborhood he had dedicated over 2 decades as a police officer and decided that Darius Holloway didn't belong there. Officer Trent Barlow saw a black man in old clothes next to a beautiful car and made a decision without calling dispatch, without probable cause, without a single fact to stand on, turning Darius's morning into something neither of them would ever forget. He had no idea that the man washing his Chevelle in that driveway had spent 2 decades as a detective sergeant for the Riverbend City Police Department. He had no idea that the worn leather wallet in the back pocket of those paint-splattered work pants held a gold shield that was about to end Barlow's career, his pension, and his freedom. He had no idea that what he was about to do in a quiet cul-de-sac on that morning would dismantle not just himself, but the entire network that had protected him for over a decade. Stick around, because what happened in that driveway is the most expensive mistake a cop in this city has ever made. The morning had arrived the way good mornings are supposed to, quietly, without agenda, without the sharp, intrusive bark of an alarm clock or a particular dread that comes from knowing the day belongs to someone else. Oak Ridge Heights had settled into its weekend rhythm. Sprinklers ticked across manicured lawns. The smell of someone's bacon drifted from an open kitchen window to houses down. A pair of mockingbirds argued in the ancient live oak that split the Caldwell property from the sidewalk, their bickering carrying that cheerful, indignant quality that made it impossible to take seriously. Somewhere around the bend of the cul-de-sac, a child was attempting to ride a bicycle with training wheels, the aluminum frame scraping the asphalt in unsteady, determined arcs. It was the kind of morning that reminded a man of why he worked as hard as he did. Darius Holloway stood in his driveway in a pair of paint-splattered work pants that had survived 3 garage renovation projects, a grass-staining incident involving the back fence, and one particularly ill-advised attempt at refinishing hardwood floors. The pants were beyond saving as anything presentable, which made them perfect for the task at hand. His shirt was a faded Howard University tee, the Bison logo cracked and softened by 2 decades of washing until the cotton had achieved that ideal worn-in texture that made expensive new shirts seem like a fraud. His feet were in a pair of old canvas sneakers, the right one bearing a permanent streak of sapphire green paint along the toe from the afternoon when the Chevelle's final color code had been applied. The Chevelle. Darius paused, sponge in hand, and just looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at something he has built from almost nothing. The 1969 Chevrolet Chevelle SS sat on the concrete with the particular presence of a vehicle that has been brought back from the dead through patience, stubbornness, and a great deal of money that Renee had never asked him to account for directly, though they both understood the accounting was happening somewhere in the background of their marriage. He had found the car at an estate sale. A widow in East Riverbend selling off decades of her late husband's hobby. The Chevelle buried under tarps, an oxidized regret in the back corner of a detached garage, its original engine missing, its body riddled with rust pockets, the paint so faded it looked more like a memory of a color than an actual one. The man who sold it to him that day thought Darius was being sentimental and impractical. The man had not been entirely wrong, but now the Chevelle sat gleaming in the late morning light like a promise kept. The restoration had taken years, working only on weekends and occasional evenings, sourcing parts from specialists in 3 different states, rebuilding the 396 cubic inch engine himself with the help of a retired machinist named Elton, who lived in the neighborhood's East Block and had strong opinions about everything. The paint, deep midnight green, not the original color, but the color Darius had always imagined when he was a boy watching cars like this move through neighborhoods he had not yet been allowed to live in, had been applied in a climate-controlled shop downtown by a painter named Gus, who treated the work with the solemnity of someone painting a cathedral ceiling. The chrome bumpers were Darius's particular obsession. He polished them every Saturday morning that the weather allowed, the rhythmic circular motion of the chamois cloth against the metal serving as something between meditation and prayer. This morning, he had started working through the carnauba wax application with the slow, methodical care of a man who had nowhere else to be and no desire to be there. The garage radio played Otis Redding. Sitting on the dock of the bay, Renee had appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee, the way she always did on Saturdays, wearing her housecoat and her reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead. And she had stood there watching him work with an expression that lived somewhere between affection and resigned amusement. "You know that car is cleaner than our kitchen floor," she said. "Our kitchen floor doesn't get compliments," Darius replied without looking up. She laughed a short, warm sound and went back inside. Darius Holloway was a man who had spent over 2 decades on the Riverbend City Police Department, over 2 decades of homicide scenes and court appearances and budget meetings and the particular emotional weight that comes from spending your working days inside the worst moments of other people's lives. He had started as a patrol officer, made detective, which his mother had called finally, while his father, who drove a city bus for decades, had simply nodded and said, "Good, now watch your back," and made detective sergeant, leading the major crimes division in a unit that closed its cases at a rate that had drawn to commendations from the chief's office. He had been passed over for lieutenant twice. The first time, the position had gone to a less experienced officer with better political connections. The second time, Chief Gloria Hargrove had offered him a private apology that he had accepted without enthusiasm. He had not applied a third time. He had asked for the transfer to major crimes, buried himself in the work, and decided that the view from the place he had carved out for himself was better than the chair someone else had decided he wasn't supposed to sit in. The house at the end of Sycamore Court, a 4-bedroom craftsman with a covered porch and a backyard deep enough that the neighbors' noise became theoretical, had taken him and Renee years to afford. They had bought it after their younger daughter finished college, and the moment Darius turned the key in the front door lock for the first time, something in his chest settled that he hadn't realized was still waiting to settle. He was a man who had earned his place in the world in the specific granular way that leaves no room for ambiguity. He owned the house. He owned the car. He owned the morning. He did not see the patrol cruiser immediately. He became aware of it the way you become aware of a change in the quality of light before you identify its cause. A slight shift in the atmosphere of the morning. The mockingbirds going quiet in the live oak. The particular sound of tires moving too slowly for a car with anywhere to be. He was working his way around to the front bumper. The Otis Redding giving way to a Percy Sledge record. When the slow crawl of an engine at the edge of his peripheral vision registered with the part of his brain that had been trained over 2 decades to notice things that didn't belong. He did not turn around immediately. He kept working the chamois cloth over the chrome in steady circles, but the ease had gone out of his hands. The morning was the same morning it had been moments ago. Same mockingbirds, same smell of wax and concrete, same Percy Sledge, but something had entered it that changed its character entirely. Darius knew that feeling. He had felt it since he was a boy. He kept his hands moving and waited to see what came next. Officer Trent Barlow turned his cruiser onto Sycamore Court with the loose, comfortable authority of a man who has never genuinely questioned his right to be anywhere. He was a man with a jaw that looked engineered for argument. A military-style haircut kept past its last trim, and eyes that moved across a landscape the way a metal detector moves across a beach, not expecting nothing, but calibrated to find something and unsatisfied until it did. He had been on the Riverbend City Police Department for over a decade, which was long enough to have formed very settled opinions about how the world worked and who belonged where within it, and not quite long enough to have faced any consequence serious enough to disturb those opinions. He had transferred to the Oak Ridge Heights Patrol sector months ago. The transfer had been in the politely evasive language of departmental personnel management, initiated by mutual agreement following a review of Officer Barlow's assignment compatibility with his current precinct environment. What this meant in plain terms was that the East Side Precinct Commander, Captain Victor Lang, had spent months documenting Barlow's behavior with the patience of a man building a legal case and had finally told the district commander that he would not continue to absorb the liability. 3 use-of-force complaints in 30 months, all involving black male civilians, all dismissed before reaching formal review, all carrying the same institutional fingerprints. Captain Wade Collier of the police union had appeared at the relevant administrative hearings with prepared statements and a practiced expression of measured indignation, and had walked each complaint to the edge of formal review, and then guided it quietly into the filing cabinet where careers were protected. Barlow knew Collier the way certain people know their insurance agent, not with genuine warmth, but with the particular comfortable reliance of someone who has made a claim before and found the process smooth. The East Side transfer had felt like a punishment for a short time. By the end of the first week in Oak Ridge Heights, Barlow had revised his assessment. Oak Ridge Heights was opportunity. The neighborhood was one of the older affluent sectors of Riverbend, not gated, not patrolled by private security, but prosperous in that established oak-shaded way that comes from property values built on decades of exclusion. Quiet neighborhoods got complacent. Complacent neighborhoods bred opportunity. Proactive policing, his phrase, repeated often in the precinct break room, was the responsible response. His patrol partner, that morning, a young officer named Corey Briggs, who was still in his first year and still possessed of the rookie's fundamental desire not to make anything worse, had called in sick. Barlow was running solo. He had not reported this to dispatch before beginning his patrol, which was another one of the small procedural corners he had been cutting since the transfer, because corners existed to be cut when no one significant was watching. He turned onto Sycamore Court, and his eyes found the driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac with the efficiency of a man whose biases had been doing his seeing for him for years. He processed the scene in pieces. The neighborhood affluent, quiet, the kind of street where certain people were expected. The car restored Chevelle SS, midnight green, the kind of vehicle that suggested either old money, professional income, or criminal enterprise, depending on who was standing behind it. The man, black, broad-shouldered in worn work clothes, leaning into the driver's side with a cloth in his hand. The man's clothes did not match the car. In Barlow's particular calculus, this was the entire case. He did not think, here is a man washing his car. He did not think, here is a homeowner on a Saturday morning. The thought that formed instantly, automatically, without any of the deliberate reasoning he would later describe it as, was the thought of a predator identifying something to pursue. He reached for his radio, considered calling the stop into dispatch, and did not. There was a vague quality of satisfaction in the decision, not to a small act of operational autonomy, that felt like ownership of the moment. He activated his lights without the siren. The silent, aggressive strobing of the emergency bar, painting the oak trees in Darius's driveway in frantic blue and red. designed to disorient, and turned the cruiser into the driveway. Blocking the exit, he sat in the car before getting out. He was watching. The man in the driveway had not turned around, had not flinched, had not made a run for it. He was still working the cloth over the front bumper in steady circles, as though the police lights illuminating his driveway were not his immediate concern. That steadiness annoyed Barlow in a specific way he couldn't quite name. He got out of the cruiser with the practiced, deliberate weight of a man who has learned that physical presence can carry a message before a word is spoken, his right hand settling near the duty belt with the casual proximity that conveyed a threat while falling just short of making one. He walked toward the man in the driveway, and everything about the morning changed. Darius heard the cruiser door open and the particular creak of a loaded duty belt settling as the officer stood. He heard the footsteps on the concrete, heavy, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who was not approaching with service in mind. He placed the chamois cloth carefully on the roof of the Chevelle and turned around. The officer was white, late 30s, with the kind of build that comes from intermittent gym attendance and an excess of confidence in what the build implies. His name tag read Barlow. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but his jaw was set in a particular arrangement of muscle and certainty that Darius had seen enough times to classify immediately. Not the jaw of a man who is curious. The jaw of a man who has already decided. Darius's hands were at his sides, open, visible. He had learned the habit of visible hands before he had learned long division, taught by a father who understood the curriculum that black children in this country receive alongside their other education. "Afternoon, officer," Darius said. His voice was calm and deep, the voice of a man with no particular urgency in any direction. "Is there a problem?" Step away from the vehicle. Barlow's voice carried the flatness of manufactured authority, not naturally commanding, but practiced. He stopped about 8 feet away, feet planted wide, right hand resting near his holster. Darius took one deliberate step back from the Chevelle, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "I'm away from the car. What can I do for you?" "Whose car is this?" Barlow moved closer, stopping at roughly 5 feet, crowding the personal space in the way designed to produce a flinch. His eyes moved over the Chevelle, then came back to Darius's work clothes. "Mine," Darius said. "And what are you doing with it?" Darius glanced at the bucket of soapy water sitting beside his left foot, the chamois cloth on the roof, the garden hose coiled on the concrete. He looked back at Barlow. "I'm washing it." "I would think that's fairly obvious." Something shifted behind the sunglasses. "Don't get smart with me." I asked whose car this is. "This is a very expensive vehicle for someone dressed like that." The words landed with the casual, almost absent quality of a phrase that has been used enough times that the speaker no longer registers its specific cruelty. Darius felt the familiar bitter sting. The feeling he had spent 2 decades learning to metabolize quickly. He had been fighting this from inside the department through every available institutional channel, and from outside it by being exactly who he was in the places he was supposed to be. He made the decision in that moment with the deliberate clarity he applied to investigative decisions at crime scenes. He would not show his badge. Not yet. He wanted to see what Barlow was fully and completely, without the variable of rank changing the calculation. He wanted to see how a man like this treated a man he believed to be without protection, without recourse, without the institutional weight of a gold shield to throw on the scale. He was in some part of his mind that had never entirely stopped being a detective gathering evidence. "It's my car," Darius said quietly. "This is my driveway. My name is on the registration in the glove box and on the deed to this house. Your house. Barlow repeated in a tone that made the two words a question dressed as a statement. He looked up the manicured street with the expression of a man who has caught something in a lie. We get a lot of break-in reports in this area. High-value vehicles getting scoped out. I'm going to need to see some identification. Am I suspected of a crime? Darius asked. His tone had shifted slightly, not hostile, but carrying a new precision, the interrogative edge of a trained investigator. I'm investigating a suspicious person. Washing a car in your own driveway is not suspicious, Darius replied. It is when you won't cooperate. Barlow took another step forward. Give me your ID or we are going to have a very different kind of conversation. 2 houses down, Beatrice Caldwell had stopped pulling weeds. She was standing at her garden fence now, a small woman with silver hair and the upright posture of someone who had spent decades in a classroom and never entirely left it. She was watching the driveway with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who has lived long enough to recognize what they're seeing and has decided not to look away. Darius did not look at her. He looked at Barlow. Officer, he said, under the Fourth Amendment and the state stop and identify statutes, you cannot compel me to identify myself without reasonable and articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime. Being a black man in work clothes next to a restored vehicle does not meet that legal standard. I suspect you know that. The statement landed in the driveway between them with the quiet weight of a rock dropped into still water. Barlow was still for a moment. Patrol officers did not frequently encounter civilians who deployed. Terry stopped proceeded in driveway conversations on a Saturday morning with the calm delivery of someone reading from a manual. To a different officer, to a better officer. The specificity of Darius's response might have given pause, but Barlow was not a different officer, and the pause did not lead to recalibration. It led somewhere else. We got a lawyer here, he said, and the sneer in it was complete and ugly. He stepped forward again, closing the distance, close enough that Darius could smell the stale coffee and the artificial mint gum. Barlow was working at the corner of his jaw. Listen to me very carefully. You don't tell me what the law is. I am the law out here. I caught you casing this property. You are trespassing. Trespassing on my own property, Darius said. His voice remained steady, an anchor in the storm of manufactured chaos. Give me your ID, Barlow said, his voice dropping into a threatening register, or we are going to have a very different kind of conversation. Darius did not step back. He stood exactly where he was and looked at the officer in front of him, and he measured the distance between what he could see in the man's body, the tightness in the shoulders, the flush neck, the hand hovering above the duty belt, and where this was going. He kept his hands visible. He kept his voice level, and he began the internal work of building the case. The license plate check took moments. Darius watched Barlow walk back to the cruiser, prop the door open, and run the Chevelle's plates through the mobile data terminal. He was positioned at the right angle to see the reflection in the passenger window, and he watched Barlow read the result. The car came back registered to Darius A. Holloway. Address on Sycamore Court, Oak Ridge Heights. The address of the house behind him. Clean, no flags, no stolen vehicle report, no record of any kind. Darius watched Barlow sit with this information for several seconds. Then Barlow climbed back out of the car. Vehicle comes back registered, he said, approaching the driveway again. I still need to verify occupancy of the residence. There's been a pattern of squatting in this area. People presenting fraudulent documentation, occupying properties under false pretenses. He said it with the smooth delivery of a man who has learned that if you state an invented justification with enough confidence. Enough people won't question it. I'm going to need you to step away from the property while I conduct a welfare check on the residents. Darius looked at him for a long moment. Step away from my property while I conduct a welfare check. Standard procedure when occupancy cannot be verified. Occupancy has been verified. My name matches the registration. You ran the plates yourself. Vehicle ownership and residential occupancy are two separate issues, Barlow said with the tone of a man reciting policy he was inventing in real time. He moved between Darius and the front door of the house, a physical repositioning that had no legitimate purpose and every illegitimate one. He was using his body the way a person might use a word. They don't have to fill a space where an argument should be. Darius did not try to walk around him. He stood still. He cataloged the move, added it to what he was building. Officer Barlow, he said, and the use of the name read directly from the name tag was itself a small and deliberate message. There is no legitimate basis for what you are describing. This is my home. My wife is inside. I have owned this property for years. I can provide a mortgage statement, utility bills, a driver's license, and for neighbors who will confirm my identity in minutes. But what I am not going to do is step away from my own house while you conduct a search of it without cause or warrant. You're obstructing an active investigation. You do not have an active investigation. You have a clean plate return and a resident who is cooperating within the lawful bounds of what he is required to cooperate with. I determine what's lawful here. Barlow's voice dropped an octave, taking on the register of a threat, carefully staying on the near side of explicit. Not you. Across the street, Jamal Kendrick, grandson of a woman who lived for houses down visiting for the weekend, had stopped walking his grandmother's dog. He was standing at the opposite curb with his phone lifted, the screen glowing in his hand, the camera facing the driveway. He had started recording at the moment Barlow repositioned between Darius and the front door. Down at Beatrice Caldwell's fence. Beatrice had not moved. She was watching with her arms folded across her chest, her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, and her expression carrying the specific weight of a woman who has seen this scenario resolved badly more than once in her lifetime. Darius kept his eyes on Barlow. He kept building the case. It was the look toward the house that did it. Barlow's eyes moved from Darius's face to the front door of the house on Sycamore Court, moved there with the specific considering slowness of a man identifying a pressure point, and then a new quality entered the confrontation. Something colder and more calculated. You said your wife is inside, Barlow said. Darius's answer was measured. She is. Anyone else? Kids? Guests? That's not information I'm required to provide. Barlow nodded slowly as though a thought were forming, and he wanted Darius to watch it form. He reached for the radio on his shoulder. Not to call for backup. Not yet. Just held the mic between his fingers, a prop in the specific theater of implied consequence. Here's the thing, Barlow said, and his voice had shifted into a register that Darius recognized immediately as deliberate. Not rage, not frustration, something colder than either. The voice of a man who has found the lever and intends to use it. When I get a call about a suspicious person at a residence and I cannot verify occupancy and the occupant is being uncooperative, there are protocols I have to follow. One of those protocols involves notifying City Welfare Services for a safety check of anyone present in the building. He paused. Let that breathe. That means anyone inside needs to be able to verify their own residency. If they can't, if the documentation doesn't check out, there can be an emergency removal pending investigation. He shrugged a slow and obscene gesture of unconcern. It's a process. He said the last word with the particular unconcerned casualness of a man who knows the process will not be applied to him. Messy process. Takes time. Stressful for everybody involved. The morning stopped, not figuratively. Darius felt the time do something that it only does in moments of genuine extremity. A thickening of the air, a slowing of the world's movement. The specific sensation of a threat arriving with enough weight to alter gravity. Renee was inside that house. He heard her moving in the kitchen, the familiar percussion of her Saturday morning, the sound of her pouring a second cup of coffee, the specific rhythm of the woman he had spent decades building a life with. And Barlow had just pointed at all of it. At her. At the years of mortgage payments and the 4-bedroom. Craftsman and the kitchen floor that was cleaner than the Chevelle, and the woman who had made that joke earlier with a laugh that still lived in the air of this driveway. Emergency removal. Darius understood exactly what those two words meant applied to a black woman inside a house in a wealthy neighborhood by an officer who had already demonstrated he would invent whatever pretext he needed. He understood what it would look like, what it would feel like, what it would cost her in ways that no eventual exoneration could entirely repay. He stood perfectly still. He did not raise his voice. He did not move his hands. He stood in his driveway, in his paint-splattered work pants, and let the full weight of what Barlow had just threatened settle through him the way cold settles through a building at night. Slowly, completely into every room, and somewhere beneath the cold, something clarified. Not rage. Rage was a luxury that the situation could not afford. What clarified was something more like purpose, the specific crystalline resolve that Darius had seen on the faces of people who had been pushed past the point where accommodation was possible and had arrived at the place beyond it where something permanent needed to happen. This man had just threatened Renee. This ends here. Not just today. Not just Barlow. The whole architecture of it. Collier's protection. The dismissed complaints. The people whose names were in that personnel file. All of it ends here. Ends today and ends in a way that matters long after this driveway. Barlow was looking at him with the expression of a man waiting to watch something break. Darius did not break. Officer Sterling, he said, using the wrong name deliberately, watching for the flicker of confusion, and there it was, a small narrowing of the eyes behind the sunglasses. Excuse me, Barlow. I would like you to call a supervisor to this scene. I don't need a supervisor. I'd like you to call one anyway. Barlow let out a short, contemptuous sound. What you'd like, he said, is to make this harder than it needs to be. Give me your ID. I verify the occupancy. Everybody goes about their day. Another shrug. Or we do it the other way. Your call. Beatrice Caldwell had unfolded her arms. She was gripping the top rail of her garden fence. Now her knuckles pale against the wood, watching with a focus that had left behind all ambiguity about what she was seeing. Darius looked at Trent Barlow with the steady, undeceived eyes of a man who has just made a decision that will outlast both of them, and the decision was not one more step back, not 1 inch of yielded ground. You are making a mistake, Darius said. I am telling you that clearly as a citizen and a homeowner. You are going to want to remember this moment. I've heard that one before, Barlow said and turned to his radio. Dispatch. This is Unit 7 Foxtrot. I'm at the address on Sycamore Court, Oak Ridge Heights. I have an uncooperative male subject refusing to identify himself, requesting a backup unit. He released the mic and looked at Darius with an expression that was almost pleased. You had your chance. Darius spoke clearly and deliberately, projecting his voice at the level he had used in courtrooms and precinct briefings for 2 decades. Not shouting but caring, ensuring that the words reached every recording device and every witness on the street. I am not resisting. I have not committed any crime. I am a resident of this property. I have been entirely cooperative within the lawful bounds of what I am required to provide. I am formally requesting a supervisor be dispatched to this location. This is an unlawful stop. Barlow took a step forward and grabbed Darius's left arm. The grip was rough and purposeful, the grip of a man who has made physical contact with citizens in this way before and who has faced no lasting consequence for it. He attempted to turn Darius toward the car to initiate the compliance position, and Darius did not swing and did not shove and did not run. He planted his feet. He let his body become what it was. 220 pounds of muscle and 2 decades of defensive tactics training, standing entirely still and making no threatening movement of any kind, simply refusing to be repositioned by a man with no lawful basis for doing so. Stop resisting, Barlow said, his voice rising. I am standing perfectly still, Darius said. Barlow's grip tightened. His other hand went to his belt and produced his baton, an extendable steel rod that caught the morning sun as he extended it. The sound of the baton snapping open was loud and sharp in the quiet of the cold dash-to-dash-sack. Jamal Kendrick stopped breathing across the street. Beatrice Caldwell made a sound that was not quite a word. The raised baton was the line. Not for Darius's sake. He had been cataloging this encounter with the professional detachment of a man gathering evidence for a case he intended to win, and he had not lost that detachment for a single moment. The raised baton was the line because of Renee, who had moved to the front window and whose silhouette he could see in the glass, and because of every person on this street who was watching, and because Barlow had a baton in the air in a residential driveway on a Saturday morning aimed at a man who had not done anything except own a car and a house in the wrong zip code. According to Officer Trent Barlow's specific brand of wrong, Darius made no movement toward the officer. He did not need to. Put the baton down, Officer Barlow, Darius said, and the quality of his voice had changed. Not louder, not harsher, but carrying a weight it had not carried before, the weight of rank, of years, of an authority that does not require volume or a raised weapon to assert itself. A command voice, the voice that had ordered surveillance operations and directed homicide scenes and delivered difficult news to victims' families across 2 decades. Lower it. Now. Barlow hesitated. The hesitation lasted moments, and it was in the long accounting of the morning everything. The hesitation cracked something open in the driveway. Barlow heard something in Darius's voice that his body understood before his mind did, a register of authority that was not performed, not manufactured, not the voice of a civilian asserting his rights, but the voice of someone who had given commands in situations where the stakes of being ignored were significantly higher than this one. His hand tightened on the baton, but didn't drop it, and his feet shifted that small involuntary backward step the body makes when it begins to reassess a threat calculation it thought it had right. You don't give orders here, Barlow said, but it came out smaller than he intended. Lower the baton, Darius said again. And then you are going to stand still. You are going to watch what I do next, and you are going to look at what I produce. That is all I am asking you to do. Keep your hands. I am reaching into my back pocket, Darius said. His voice was absolutely steady. His hands moved with the deliberate choreography of a man who has performed this action in situations where a mistake in pace or angle could end badly, who has communicated not a threat to armed and frightened people through the precise language of slow and visible movement. "You are going to watch me do this." Barlow's hand was shaking slightly. The morning had not gone how it was supposed to go, and somewhere below his manufactured certainty a current of genuine unease had started running, though he couldn't yet name what he was uneasy about. The man in front of him had not behaved like any civilian Barlow had ever encountered. He had not flinched, not raised his voice, not run, not begged, not produced the vocabulary of a man who was afraid. He had used legal terminology with casual precision. He had given commands in a voice that seemed to expect obedience. He had been through the entire encounter in some fundamental and unshakable way entirely in control of himself. Barlow's uncertainty was not wisdom. It was a predator's instinct registering that something about the prey wasn't right. Darius's right hand moved to his back pocket, visible the entire way, and produced a worn leather badge wallet, the leather soft and dark with use, the edges rounded by years of pocket and hand. He held it in front of him at chest height. He did not open it immediately. He held it for 2 full seconds, long enough for Barlow to look at it, to register what it was, before he could see what was inside it, to experience the specific pause of a man standing at a door he hadn't expected to find. Then Darius's wrist turned and the wallet opened. The afternoon sun was at the precise angle that made the gold unavoidable. It caught the shield directly, not glinting off it, the way cheap metal glints, but absorbing the light and giving it back with a deep, rich, unhurried intensity of something substantial, something earned over a very long time and at very specific cost. The heavy engraved Detective Sergeant's shield of the Riverbend City Police Department Major Crimes Division, not a patrolman's silver disc. Something older and denser and entirely different in the way that it was different. Beside it in the identification window, the department-issued photo, Darius Holloway, Detective Sergeant Major Crimes Division, star number 447. The photograph showed a man in full dress blues, a collar full of commendation citations, looking out at the camera and at anyone examining this credential, with the composed authority of someone who has been in rooms far more serious than a driveway on a Saturday morning. It was the same face standing in front of Barlow right now in paint-splattered work pants and a faded Howard University shirt. Barlow's brain performed the specific agonizing work of receiving information that contradicts a foundational assumption. He looked at the gold shield. He looked at the ID photograph. He looked at the work pants. He looked back at the badge. His mouth opened. No sound came. The color moved out of his face from the temples downward, a tide going out fast and total, leaving something gray and slack in its place, the specific pallor that arrives when the blood finds other priorities. His jaw continued moving, opening and closing with the automatic disconnected quality of a machine that hasn't received the signal to stop. His eyes moved from the badge to the work pants and back to the badge and back to the face, performing the loop over and over as though a sufficient number of repetitions might produce a different result. Then his hand dropped from the baton. Not a controlled movement, not a decision. The arm simply fell the way a load falls when you stop holding it up, the muscles going slack because whatever signal had been keeping them taut had just been interrupted at the source. The baton swung limply against his leg, and then he released it entirely, and the steel rod hit the concrete of Darius's driveway with a sound that seemed to echo for longer than physics should have allowed, a sound that rang through the cul-de-sac and reached Beatrice Caldwell at her fence and Jamal Kendrick across the street and settled into the quiet morning air like the final word in a very long argument. Barlow stared at the badge. He stared at it the way a man stares at something that has just restructured the architecture of the next years of his life. Sergeant Barlow, finally said. The word came out fractured, to syllables that carried the sound of something irreversible, the sound of a door closing behind you and understanding for the first time that there is no handle on the inside. I didn't. You didn't what? Darius said. His voice had returned to the calm, level register of a man who has arrived somewhere. He intended to arrive not with triumph, but with the absolute quiet weight of authority applied to a situation it had been waiting patiently to correct. Asterisk. You didn't realize black men own homes in Oak Ridge Heights. You didn't realize we restore classic cars, work on them ourselves, spend a Saturday morning doing something ordinary in the house we earned. He let each question stand for a moment before the next. Or did you simply not care because you believed you could walk into a man's driveway and bully him for what you decided he was when you looked at him? Barlow's mouth moved again. Nothing. Two police cruisers rounded the bend of Sycamore Court simultaneously, their engines preceded by a brief burst of siren killed as they turned onto the residential street. Doors swinging open, boot heels on asphalt. Sergeant Carla Fields emerged from the first cruiser, a veteran with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of face that had seen enough mornings to know immediately what kind this was. She walked across the driveway with the quick assessing step of a senior officer reading a scene, and her eyes moved from Barlow's pale baton, dropped in the posture of a man expecting to be struck, to the badge wallet in Darius's hand, and she stopped as if she had walked into a wall she hadn't seen. Sergeant Holloway. She came to full attention. Not the formal military kind, the instinctive kind. The kind a career officer produces when faced with someone whose rank and reputation command it without asking. Sir, from the second cruiser, Officer Travis Webb, who had sat in more of Darius's briefings than he could count, climbed out, took in the scene in a single sweep, and stood at attention beside his vehicle without being told to officers, both standing at attention, for the man in the work pants. Barlow looked at Fields. He looked at Webb. He looked at Darius. He looked at the department ID photograph one more time, and in the specific quality of his silence. In that moment, the silence of a man watching every exit close simultaneously, the entire years of what he had been, and what he had done, and what he had believed he could continue to do, collapsed into the space of a single irreversible second. Then, on Barlow's own radio, the radio through which he had called for backup earlier, the dispatcher's voice crackled out across the driveway. Unit 7 Foxtrot copy. Also, Sergeant Holloway, are you on scene at Sycamore Court, the department's own system, addressing Darius by rank over Barlow's radio? In Barlow's driveway, in front of the backup Barlow had called for himself, Beatrice Caldwell, at her fence, slowly unclenched her hands from the rail. Across the street, Jamal Kendrick lowered his phone. From the front door of the house, Renee Holloway stood on the porch and watched her husband, Morning Sun, in his paint-splattered work pants and his faded Howard University shirt, and her expression carried everything that decades of marriage had made between them, compressed into a single look that required no words and crossed the yard without effort. Darius closed the badge wallet. He slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at Trent Barlow one last time with the calm, undeceived gaze of a man who has arrived somewhere he has been moving toward for a long time. Then he picked up his chamois cloth from the roof of the Chevelle and finished the front bumper. Sergeant Carla Fields had been a police officer for long enough to have developed an efficient internal vocabulary for the different categories of situations she encountered. There were situations that were what they appeared to be. There were situations that were worse than they appeared to be. And there were situations that when you arrived at them, had already resolved themselves in a way that left you with a very specific and uncomfortable administrative function. This was the third kind. She approached Barlow with the professional briskness of a woman who had no interest in extending this scene any longer than necessary. "Officer Barlow, your weapon, your badge, and your radio, please." She produced an evidence bag from her belt, holding it open with the quiet procedural neutrality of a person who has been in enough of these moments to know that commentary is not useful. Barlow looked at the bag. He looked at Darius. He looked at Fields. He appeared for a moment to be calculating something, the angles of it, the possible exits, the likelihood that there was still a version of this morning that ended differently. Whatever calculation he ran, it returned nothing useful. He unclipped his radio, first setting it into the bag with stiffness in his fingers that was either cold or something else. His badge came next, the Silver Shield Standard Patrol issue standard in every way that Darius's was not. He placed it in the bag without ceremony. Then the duty weapon, which Fields accepted through secondary protocol, noting the make and serial number on a small card. "Suspension is effective immediately," Darius said. He stood at the side of his driveway with the chamois cloth in one hand and the authority of his rank in the other, and both were equally present. "You are not to contact fellow officers about the events of this morning. You are not to access departmental systems, files, or communications. If union representation contacts you, you are free to speak with them. If anyone else from the department contacts you, refer them to internal affairs." He paused, giving Barlow the specific amount of time it takes for instructions to move from the ears to the place in the brain where they register as real. "Do you understand?" "Yes," Barlow said. The word was barely audible. Darius turned and looked at his house. Renee had come out to the porch barefoot on the painted boards, her housecoat wrapped around her. She was holding her coffee cup in both hands and looking at him from across the yard with an expression that asked a specific question without words. And Darius met it with a specific answer that requires no words either. A slow nod, a slight downward tilt of the chin. He watched her shoulders drop, and he understood exactly what that meant, and it meant everything. Beatrice Caldwell spoke from her fence with the clear, caring voice of a woman who taught 7th grade English for decades and never once had to raise it to be heard. We all saw it, Darius. Every last bit of it. The whole street. She wasn't offering testimony, not yet. She was offering something deeper and more immediate. Witness, the specific declaration a community makes when it refuses to pretend it didn't see what it saw. "Thank you," Darius said. She nodded. Barlow was escorted to Fields' cruiser. He walked with the stiff, disconnected gait of someone whose body is performing a movement his mind is not directing. He did not look back at the Chevelle. He looked at the street in front of his feet with the focused, tunneling attention of a man trying very hard to hold himself inside the present moment and not let himself understand what all of it means. The cruiser door closed. Darius picked up his sponge, dipped it in the bucket of soapy water, and began working on the passenger door of the Chevelle. The Percy Sledge record had ended. From inside the garage, something new was playing. Sam Cooke, "A Change Is Gonna Come," which struck Darius in the quiet that followed the cruiser's departure as so precisely appropriate to the moment that he almost smiled. He worked the sponge over the door in slow, even circles. The morning settled back into itself. The mockingbirds in Beatrice's oak tree resumed their argument. From somewhere around the bend of the cul-de-sac, the training wheel bicycle was attempting the slope again. Barlow's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building, on the west side of Riverbend that had been constructed with the ambition of budget efficiency and the result of a building that carried its own atmosphere of institutional resignation, hallways that smelled of carpet cleaner and cooking oil, a parking lot perpetually one space short. He sat on his couch the next morning, with his phone in his hand, and ran the same calculation he had been running since the afternoon in the progressively shifting light of a man who needs a different answer than the one the math keeps producing. He called Wade Collier. Collier picked up on the second ring with the voice of a man who had already heard. "I know," Collier said before Barlow could identify himself. "I got a call from Carla Fields." Barlow told him everything. He had rehearsed it overnight, and it came out with the smoothness of a narrative that has been revised several times. He had received an informal community concern flag to his sector. He had been conducting a welfare check when the occupant became uncooperative and refused lawful requests. The subject had physically resisted when Barlow attempted a standard compliance maneuver. Barlow had deployed his baton in the interest of officer safety. The subject had then produced a police credential. He said this last part with the particular neutrality of a man trying to present it as an incidental detail rather than the load-bearing element of the entire story. Silence on the other end. Kyle Collier said, "Did you call the stop into dispatch before you activated your lights?" A pause. "I was going to call it in after I made contact." Another silence. Longer. "Did you turn on your body camera before you got out of the cruiser?" "It was already on from the prior patrol." "Right." Collier exhaled the exhale of a man doing mental accounting in real time. "Here's the situation as I currently understand it. You stopped a detective sergeant from major crimes on his day off on his own property without dispatch notification, without documented probable cause, attempted to detain him, deployed your baton, and did not identify his credential when it was produced. He didn't present the credential until after I know when he presented it. That's not the part I'm concerned about." Collier paused. "Trent, the body camera was on the whole time." The statement sat between them with the weight of a very large and very immovable object. "I know," Barlow said, "and the body camera caught everything. I know, including you putting your hand on your holster before he moved." A longer pause. Outside Barlow's apartment window, a car alarm went off in the parking lot and then stopped. Sunday morning continued its indifferent progress. "The union files standard grievance procedures in the event of termination," Collier said. "I can do that. I've done it before. But Trent, I need you to understand something. The prior 3 complaints, I was able to manage those because the documentation was incomplete and the situations were ambiguous. This is not ambiguous. This has a body camera, and based on what Fields is telling me, it may also have civilian footage from a neighbor's security camera." He paused again. "A detective sergeant from major crimes. Trent. Do you understand what that means for how this gets handled? I didn't know who he was. I understand that." Another exhale. "Get some rest. Don't talk to anyone from the department until I can assess what we're working with. I'll be in touch." The call ended. Barlow set the phone on the couch cushion and looked at the television. A football pregame show was running men in suits discussing something with great enthusiasm. He watched it without processing any of it. He told himself with the specific self-deception of a man who needs to sleep that tomorrow would find an angle. Tomorrow always found an angle. 3 times before the angle had been found. The union had resources. The department had procedures. There was always a version of events that could be managed into something survivable. He went to bed almost comfortable with the belief that he would be fine. He did not know that later that night, while he was asleep, Gerald Whitman, a retired contractor who lived directly across the cul-de-sac from the house on Sycamore Court, had spent the evening reviewing the previous day's footage from the security system installed around his property following a package theft. The camera mounted above his front porch had as a function of its wide-angle lens and his property's elevation a clear and unobstructed view of the entire Sycamore Court cul-de-sac, including the Holloway driveway. The footage showed in high-definition resolution with a timestamp overlay a River Bend City Police Department patrol cruiser turning onto Sycamore Court and coming to a slow stop. The officer inside did not exit the vehicle. The footage showed him sitting in the cruiser stationary for moments watching Darius Holloway wash his car. It showed the officer making no radio transmission during that period. It showed the emergency lights activating. It showed the officer exiting the vehicle and walking toward the driveway with his right hand already near his duty belt. Gerald Whitman copied the relevant segment to a flash drive and emailed it to the River Bend City Police Department's Civilian Oversight Board with a subject line that read Incident at Sycamore Court. Complete prior police footage you may need. He CC'd the Internal Affairs Division. Meanwhile, at the same hour in his home office on Sycamore Court, Darius Holloway was at his desk with Barlow's personnel file on the screen forwarded by Fields with a quiet note that said, "Only thought you'd want to see the full picture." Reading through 3 use of force complaint reports that had each been filed, reviewed, and closed without formal disciplinary action, he read them with the careful methodical attention he gave to case files. He noted the name that appeared on the closing authorization for all 3. He noted the dates, the demographics of the complainants, the similarity of language in Barlow's own written accounts of each incident. He picked up his phone and called District Attorney Victor Webb. Webb picked up on the 3rd ring. "I expected to hear from you," he said. "Then you've already seen the body camera footage," Darius said. "It was flagged to my office this afternoon along with the neighbor's security footage that arrived in the IA inbox late tonight." A pause. "Darius, tell me you want to pursue this properly." "I want to pursue this properly," Darius said. "All of it, not just that morning. The 3 prior complaints, the authorization chain that closed them, the pattern." A longer pause. When Webb spoke again, his voice had the quality of a prosecutor who has just been handed a case he knows he can win. "I can have a grand jury convened within the month." "Good," Darius said. He closed the personnel file, turned off the desk lamp, and sat in the dark of his office for a few minutes listening to the house settle around him. The familiar sound of his home, the specific quiet that belongs to the place a man has built. And then he went to bed. Darius walked through the glass doors of the River Bend City Police Department's main district precinct on Monday morning, wearing his class dress uniform. The brass buttons were polished to mirror finish. His trousers carried a crease that could measure a right angle. The gold detective sergeant's shield on his left breast caught the fluorescent lighting and gave it back with interest. He walked with the measured pace of a man who has been in this building for over 2 decades and has no reason to hurry. He moved through the bullpen quickly. On a normal Monday, it held the raucous energy of officers arriving for shift change. This Monday carried the heavy crackling undercurrent of a place where people are being very careful about what they say out loud. The news of what had happened on Sycamore Court had moved through the department with the velocity of information that carries genuine stakes. Officers who were crossing the bullpen slowed and nodded the nod of someone who has chosen their side and wants that choice to be visible. Darius walked through, without pausing, headed toward the basement internal affairs offices. He gave his statement to Detective Mar Voss in a conference room on the 2nd floor. Precise chronological stripped of editorial commentary. He described each exchange, each of Barlow's actions, each of his own responses in the flat, detailed language of an experienced investigator narrating a case to a colleague. He did not embellish. He did not characterize Barlow beyond what the record required. He simply described what had happened. Downstairs the trap was closing. Voss was compact, with dark hair cut close to her skull and eyes that operated on an independent evaluation system. They continued assessing while her face remained professionally neutral. Yersinia, coming from financial crimes. She thought about cases the way accountants think about numbers. Every figure has a source. Every source can be verified, and the gap between the claimed figure and the actual figure always more interesting than either alone. Barlow sat across from her with Collier to his left. He looked like a man who had convinced himself the night before that the math was survivable and was now in the fluorescent light of Monday morning beginning to revise that assessment. Voss opened her laptop without preamble. "Officer Barlow," she said, "your written statement from that morning characterizes the subject as physically resistive and states your baton deployment was in response to an aggressive movement toward you." She looked at him with the specific quality of patience that comes from having no interest in the answer being what she expects. "I'd like to walk through the body camera footage." Alongside that statement, the footage played. It showed everything. Darius's hands consistently visible, consistently still throughout every exchange. The license plate returned clean, matching the Holloway and Barlow's decision to continue regardless. The moment Barlow moved between Darius and his own front door, each exchange in crystal clear audio that the body camera's directional microphone had captured with the impartiality of a machine that has no stake in the outcome. The holster unsnap, the baton deployment, Darius standing perfectly still through all of it. Voice measured and precise, hands never once moving toward Barlow. When the video reached the badge reveal and the sound of the baton hitting the concrete, Barlow looked away from the screen. Voss paused the footage. "Your written statement indicates you deployed your baton because the subject made a sudden aggressive movement toward me," she said. "The footage shows the subject standing still, with his hands at his sides at the time of baton deployment." She looked at him. "Would you like to revise that?" Barlow opened his mouth. Collier put a hand on his arm. "Trent." The voice had none of the comfortable warmth that usually carried when managing someone's problem. It had a careful, neutral quality. The voice of a man choosing words with the awareness that words are being chosen. "Don't." Voss stepped out of the room to allow them a moment. The door closed. In the silence that followed, Collier looked at Trent Barlow with the expression of a man who has done this job for a long time and has arrived at a specific and unambiguous conclusion. "The body camera footage is what it is," Collier said. "I've reviewed it. I cannot characterize it as ambiguous because it isn't. Your written statement contradicts it in 3 specific points." He paused. "There is also an additional footage source, a neighbor's security camera that captured you stationary in your cruiser before you activated your lights. No dispatch call, no radio contact, moments of documented surveillance before initiating the stop." Barlow stared at the table. Collier continued. "The union files standard grievance procedures in the event of termination. I am obligated to tell you that." A pause that carried the weight of what was coming. "I am also obligated to tell you that based on the material currently in Voss's file, a grievance will not produce a different outcome. It will extend the timeline. It will not change the destination." He collected his folder, straightened his tie, and stood. "I'd advise you to consult a criminal defense attorney," he said, "before the end of this week." He knocked twice on the door and Voss returned. Collier walked out without looking back at the man he had protected. 3 times before, and would not be protecting a fourth. The formal hearing convened weeks later in the department's administrative conference room on the fourth floor, a room designed for the specific business of institutional consequence, with its long mahogany table and the city seal on the wall and the particular quality of light that comes through institutional blinds on a weekday afternoon. Chief of Police Gloria Hargrove sat at the head of the table, flanked by Deputy Chief Roland Torres and Civilian Oversight Board Representative Elaine Sterling, a retired federal judge. At the far end sat Trent Barlow and his attorney Craig Harlan, who had spent time constructing an argument that the incident on Sycamore Court represented an overzealous but good faith exercise of patrol discretion, a phrase that, as Harlan had privately concluded while reviewing the body camera footage for the fourth time, had the structural integrity of a dam built from good intentions. District Attorney Victor Webb sat along the side walls, an observer. His presence communicated everything it was intended to communicate. Darius sat on the right side of the table in dress uniform. No papers in front of him. No notes. He had been sitting at tables like this for over 2 decades and had long since stopped needing to perform the quality of his attention. Harlan presented his argument, smooth delivery, professional framing. At no point during those minutes did Chief Hargrove turn to look at him. She was reading the body camera transcript with the steady attention of someone who has formed a view and is looking for anything that would revise it. She found nothing that revised it. "Sergeant Holloway," she said, "the board recognizes you." Darius stood. "I've written statements before," he said. "I've written them about things I've investigated. I've never written one about something that happened to me. So, I'm going to do something different this morning." He looked around the table at Hargrove, at Torres, at Sterling, and then at Barlow directly. "I'm going to tell you what the morning felt like," he told them, the Chevelle. The morning earned by over 2 decades of work, the reflex, that feeling that every black man of his generation in this country learns before long division. When the patrol cruiser slowed at the entrance to his cul-de-sac, he described each exchange with Barlow with the precision of a trained investigator and the authority of a man speaking about what was done to his own body in front of his own home. And then he came to the part that mattered most. "When he looked toward my house," Darius said, and his voice carried something heavier in it than it had been carrying, and told me that anyone inside could be subject to emergency removal. "I want to be honest about what I felt. I felt what every man feels when a threat is made against the people he is responsible for. I felt the specific fear that has nothing to do with yourself and everything to do with what you have built and who you have built it with." He paused. He looked at Barlow. "And then I felt something else. I felt the weight of 3 prior complaints that were filed and dismissed. I felt the weight of the people who filed them and were told by one mechanism or another that the system would not listen. This is not a one-morning problem. This is over a decade of the same behavior protected by the same structural accommodations, finally expressing itself in a location where the accommodation had run out." He looked at Hargrove directly. "I am not asking for Officer Barlow's termination because he insulted me," Darius said, his voice dropping to the register of an instrument that does not need amplification to be heard. "I am demanding it because he is a danger to the citizens of this city, and I am asking that the full authorization chain for those 3 prior dismissed complaints be examined, not just the branch, the root." He sat down. The silence that followed lasted several seconds, which is a very long time in a room full of people with things they could say. Chief Hargrove did not deliberate. "Officer Trent Barlow," she said, "effective immediately, Your employment with the Riverbend City Police Department is terminated for cause. I am simultaneously forwarding a formal request to the State Peace Officer, Standards and Training Commission for permanent decertification. You will never wear a badge in this state. She looked at him without particular emotion. The grounds are documented racial profiling, unlawful detention, falsification of incident report details, and conduct unbecoming. D.A. Webb leaned forward from his chair along the wall. Mr. Barlow, the district attorney's office has completed its preliminary criminal review. A grand jury convenes soon. I would encourage you to spend the next days in close consultation with your attorney. Harlan put a hand on Barlow's arm. Professional management, not comfort. As Barlow was escorted from the building, he walked down the corridor with the gait of a man whose body is performing a movement. His mind is not directing. At the end of the corridor, he pushed through the glass door and stepped into an afternoon that was entirely indifferent to his presence within it. Darius remained seated for a moment after the room began to clear. Hargrove waited. The 3 prior complaints, Darius said. The closing authorizations. Voss has already flagged them, Hargrove said. The board will review the full chain. She paused. The Oversight Commission chair position, the civilian board is asking. Darius considered this. He thought about the 3 people whose complaints had been dismissed, whose names he had read, who had attempted to use the available mechanism for addressing what had happened to them and had been told by the structure that Collier administered that their experience was insufficient for action. Tell the board yes, he said. The Riverbend County Courthouse. By the morning that State versus Barlow was scheduled to begin jury selection, had acquired the particular atmosphere of a civic event that has outgrown its original dimensions. Satellite trucks occupied most of the plaza. Camera positions from for national news organizations flanked the wide limestone steps. A documentary crew that had been following the case had established a position near the main entrance that the courthouse's security staff had negotiated down to a single stationary camera, an arrangement that satisfied no one and served everyone adequately. Inside courtroom, Trent Barlow sat at the defense table and looked nothing like the man who had patrolled Sycamore Court on a Saturday morning. He had lost weight since the driveway, though he couldn't have told you exactly when. His face had a drawn quality, the suit Craig Harlan had advised him to purchase for the trial. Charcoal conservative communicating something other than what his patrol uniform had communicated. Did its technical job. What it could not do was restore the posture. The posture was simply gone. The jaw that had looked engineered for argument now sat loose on his face with the particular slack quality of a feature that has lost its primary function. His eyes, which in his patrol days had moved through environments with the scanning confidence of a man convinced of his welcome, now tracked the courtroom with the careful reactive movement of someone assessing risk rather than asserting authority. Asterisk beside him. Craig Harlan had his trial materials organized in his standard color-coded system. He had studied the available footage more than times. He had concluded with the professional self-assessment of a defense attorney who has learned to be honest with himself in private, if nowhere else, that the argument was solid enough to produce at minimum a hung jury on the felony assault charge. The key variable was Darius Holloway. Harlan's strategy rested entirely on reframing, not what had happened. The footage was the footage, but what it meant. An off-duty officer plainclothes is declining to identify himself, physically resisting when a patrol officer attempted a compliance maneuver, a superior officer setting up a junior one, deliberately concealing his rank to produce a disciplinary outcome, a man trying to do a job in circumstances that were not what they appeared. District Attorney Victor Webb opened for the state with the brisk factual confidence of a man who does not feel the need to make a case seem more than it is, because it is already everything. No emotional language, no rhetorical architecture, just the sequence of documented events, the footage, and the 3 prior dismissed complaints admitted as pattern evidence over Harlan's objections by Judge Helena Reed. A woman with the precise judicial demeanor of someone who has heard a great deal of argument in her career and is not impressed by volume. The footage played for the jury without commentary. The 12 men and women watched the body camera footage with the concentrated attention of people who are forming opinions and are aware that the opinions they form here will have consequences. They watched Arias's hands consistently visible, consistently still. They heard each exchange. They heard the welfare check threat, and 2 jurors in the back row made small involuntary movements in their seats. The kind of physical response that bodies make when they process something their minds identify as genuinely wrong. Webb let the footage finish. He let the silence stand. Then he began. Across the courtroom, Darius sat in his dress uniform with Renee beside him on the gallery bench, her hand in his. He watched the footage play with the specific removed attention of a detective reviewing case evidence. Focused, analytical, the warmth of Renee's hand was steady against his palm. Darius was called to the stand on the 2nd day of the trial. He walked from the gallery to the witness stand, with the unhurried, contained pace that was simply how he moved through spaces dressed in the same class A uniform he had worn to every institutional proceeding since the morning in the driveway, and he swore the oath. With the steady, caring voice that had delivered briefings and testimony and seen assessments across over 2 decades. He sat with the posture of a man who has been in chairs like this before and has always told the truth in them and has never found the experience particularly frightening. Under Webb's direct examination, Darius narrated the events of the morning with the precision and objectivity of a detective describing an investigation to a review panel. He did not embellish. He did not editorialize. He presented the facts in their sequence, each one documented by evidence already in the record, and he described his own decisions. The decision not to immediately identify himself, the decision to remain still, the decision to maintain calm with the same matter-of-fact clarity he applied to everything else. Sergeant Holloway, Webb said toward the end of direct examination, "You've described maintaining significant composure throughout a confrontation that involved an officer pointing a weapon at you, attempting to physically restrain you, and threatening to have your wife removed from your home. Why didn't you simply identify yourself as a police officer?" At the beginning, Darius considered the question for a moment. "Because I am a citizen first," he said. "I have been a citizen of this city my entire life. I was a citizen before I was a police officer, and I will be one long after. A citizen should not need a badge in their back pocket to be treated with basic dignity on their own property on a Saturday morning." He paused, "And I chose to wait because I wanted to understand what I was dealing with. I know the difference between an officer who makes an error and an officer who operates with a sustained conviction that certain people do not require the protections that other people receive automatically." Officer Barlow was not confused. He was not uncertain. He made a series of deliberate choices from the moment he turned onto my street without calling dispatch to the moment he raised his baton. And every one of those choices was made with the confidence of a man who had made them before without consequence. The courtroom was very quiet. Webb nodded and sat down. Craig Harlan approached the podium for cross-examination with the particular energy of a man who has spent months preparing for this specific moment, his strategy not to destroy Darius's credibility. That was not achievable, but to introduce the possibility that the situation was more complicated than the state was representing, that Darius's deliberate concealment of his identity had created conditions that produced the outcome. Sergeant Holloway, Harlan began, you are a decorated officer, extensive training in defensive tactics, de-escalation, suspect compliance. Correct, that's correct. You are in fact a certified defensive tactics instructor for the entire district. I am. So, when a patrol officer approaches a large, physically imposing man who is declining to provide identification and refusing compliance directives, isn't it reasonable that the officer might feel genuine apprehension? Might feel his safety was at risk? Darius looked at Harlan with the expression of a man who can see exactly where the trail is going and is not going to pretend he can't. I was declining to provide identification. I was not legally required to provide, Darius said. Lawful compliance directives must be lawful. Directives based on manufactured probable cause are not. The training you're describing would clarify that distinction for any officer with adequate preparation. Harlan adjusted his approach. Sergeant, you intentionally concealed your police identity during the entire confrontation. You made a decision to withhold it, which had the effect of prolonging the encounter and escalating the risk to both parties. Officer Barlow created every escalation, Darius said. My decisions were responses to his. I escalated nothing. I threatened no one. I touched no one. My decision to wait was the same decision that anyone who does not have a badge to produce makes in every one of these encounters. They wait and they hope and they try to survive the interaction without being harmed. Harlan tried several more angles over the next minutes. He attempted to frame Darius's physical presence as inherently intimidating. He suggested that Darius's legal knowledge was a form of deliberate provocation. He attempted to paint the situation as one that Darius, with his training and rank, could have diffused at any moment and chose not to for personal reasons. Darius answered each question with the same measured factual clarity. He did not get angry. He did not get flustered. He did not retreat behind official language when plain language served better. He sat in the witness chair and told the truth in the specific, precise way of a man who has told the truth in difficult circumstances many times before and has found that the truth delivered with sufficient clarity and patience tends to stand up. By the time Harlan sat down, he looked like a man who had been climbing a hill for minutes and had arrived at the top to find there was another hill. Darius looked like a man who could have continued for another week. He stepped down from the stand, walked back through the well of the court, and took his seat beside Renee. She leaned very slightly against his shoulder for a fraction of a second that no one else in the courtroom would have noticed. He noticed. Harlan made his desperation visible on the fourth day. The evidence was not going well. The body camera footage had been played twice, once at normal speed and once in a slowed version. The Whitman doorbell footage had been authenticated and admitted, and the jury had watched in high-definition resolution. A Riverbend City police officer sit in his cruiser for moments observing a man wash a car before activating his emergency lights without radio contact. The 3 prior dismissed complaints had come in as pattern evidence through the testimony of each complainant. 3 black men from different parts of the city describing encounters with Barlow over years that bore the structural fingerprint of the encounter on Sycamore Court. Each of them had filed complaints. Each had been dismissed. Each now sat in the gallery and watched the proceedings with the particular attention of people for whom this trial was about something larger than the formal charges. Harlan had 1 card left. He called Trent Barlow to the stand. Barlow took the oath with a trembling hand. He sat in the witness chair with the posture of a man carrying something very heavy. Under Harlan's direct examination, he wept. He described the morning as a patrol officer trying to do his job in an unfamiliar district. He described his fear. Genuine, he said, his voice breaking, when a large man refused his commands. He described the baton deployment as an act not of aggression, but of desperation. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the jury, and then he said something that hadn't been in any prior statement. Right before the camera picked up the audio clearly, Barlow said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. He leaned toward me and he told me. He said he was going to take my gun. The statement landed in courtroom the way unexpected things land in enclosed spaces. A pulse of changed air, a collective micro-movement, a shifting of weight in chairs. Harlan held the moment with the careful neutrality of a man watching the element he needed begin to work. The jurors in the front row were frowning, not with rejection, with consideration. The specific frown of people genuinely uncertain about something they thought they were certain about. On the gallery bench, Darius watched Barlow make the claim with the quiet, still attention of a man watching a trap close around someone who built it themselves. Victor Webb stood for cross-examination with the serene composure of a man who has been waiting for exactly this. Mr. Barlow, he said, walking slowly toward the center of the floor, you claim you were frightened. You claim you were just a patrol officer in an unfamiliar area doing his job, overwhelmed by a situation that got away from him. He had ridden the transport bus for hours in the specific discomfort of steel restraints on his wrists and ankles, chained to the seat, and watching the late autumn landscape through scratched polycarbonate. He had tried to hold himself inside the boundaries of the immediate moment because the larger architecture of what was coming was not yet manageable to look at directly. The intake process was methodical and indifferent. He was stripped of the transport clothes and issued the facility standard uniform, orange cotton rough at the seams, laundered so many times that the color had faded at the edges to something almost yellow at the hem. He was photographed, fingerprinted, assessed by a nurse who asked questions in a tone that was efficient without being unkind, and assigned to a housing unit because of his prior law enforcement status. He was placed in a protective custody unit for his physical safety. The corrections officer who walked him to his cell explained this with the flat professionalism of a man for whom this conversation happened regularly. The protective custody unit was not dangerous. It was also not a sanctuary. It was a tomb. His cell was a concrete box measuring approximately 8 by 10 feet. A steel platform served as a bed with a mattress that had been designed to the minimum standard required to be called one. A stainless steel toilet and sink unit occupied the far corner. A narrow window set high in the concrete wall emitted a strip of sky that changed color with the time of day and served as the room's only connection to the world outside the building. The door closed behind him with the specific mechanical certainty of a door designed to stay closed. In protective custody, he had 1 hour per day outside the cell, hours per day inside it. In the first days, he tried to think about the legal angles. The appeal Harlan's mentions of reversible error on the prior complaint's admission, the contestable audio recording. He held onto these thoughts the way a man in water holds onto the nearest floating thing, not because the thing is sufficient, but because holding it uses energy that would otherwise be occupied by the alternative. But the cell had a way of dissolving the narratives you brought into it. He was not a patrol officer here. He was a number printed on the back of a faded orange shirt. The complete removal of every identity that had been performing the work of making him feel entitled to what he had done arrived with a completeness that was genuinely difficult to withstand. In the long hours of the cell, Trent Barlow was forced into the specific confrontation that the driveway, the precinct, the courtroom, and the transport bus had each in their own way been delaying a direct encounter with himself without the performance of authority to stand between him and what he actually was. He replayed the driveway compulsively. He saw Darius's hands always visible. He heard Darius's voice steady and clear and carrying that quality of complete self-possession that had he understood now with the clarity of hindsight communicated something he had chosen not to hear. He saw the gold shield opening in the afternoon sun. He saw Fields standing at attention. He saw his baton on the concrete. He had told himself for over a decade that he was doing a job. The cell had a different teaching. In the single hour he was permitted outside each day, he was walked to a small interior recreation area where a television mounted on the wall, news and entertainment in rotation. On a Wednesday afternoon, weeks after his arrival, a young corrections officer, early 20s, broad-shouldered with the particular unhurried authority of someone who does not need to perform power because it simply belongs to him in this building, directed Barlow to the cleaning supply room to collect a mop and bucket for his assigned corridor shift. "You're on tiles through today," the officer said, not looking up from his clipboard. "Mop closet is at the end of the hall." He handed Barlow the sheet without ceremony, without recognition, without any of the accommodation that Barlow had for over a decade experienced as the natural texture of institutional life. Barlow took the sheet. He collected the mop. He worked tiles through in the long echoing corridor with the slow mechanical rhythm of someone with no particular relationship to the task and years to complete it. At the far end of the corridor, through a reinforced window looking into the common area, the wall-mounted television was running a local news segment. Barlow recognized the Riverbend City Hall conference room on the screen. He recognized the man seated at the head of the table, in a gray suit addressing the assembled members of the newly formed Independent Civilian Oversight Commission with the particular unhurried authority of a man who has decided this is the work he intends to do and intends to do it well. Darius Holloway, speaking about accountability structures, independent review protocols, citizen reporting channels that did not root through the same department they were reporting on. Barlow stood at the corridor window and watched for moments before the officer at the other end of the hall called out that he needed to keep moving. He kept moving. He thought about the three complainants. Their names were in his memory now in a way they had not been before, not as cases he had managed, not as files that had been reviewed and closed, but as three specific people who had encountered him in the way you encounter something that damages you, who had attempted to use the available mechanism for addressing that damage, and who had been told that their experience was insufficient for action. He thought about them in his cell at night, and the thinking had a quality he didn't have precise vocabulary for. Not guilt exactly, not remorse in the way the word is usually deployed, but a recognition that was colder and more permanent than either. The recognition of what he had actually done and what it had actually cost the people he had done it to. Years is a very long time. He had a great deal of it still to go. The first Saturday morning in late April arrived with a quality of light that is not quite the same as the light of any other season, cleaner and more direct, carrying the particular promise of warmth without yet delivering the weight of summer heat. Darius was in his driveway. He wore the same paint-splattered work pants that had survived 3 garage renovation projects and a gross-staining incident and one ill-fated attempt at hardwood floor refinishing, and which having now also survived a confrontation with a police officer, a termination hearing, a felony trial, and the months that followed. All of them had achieved a kind of threadbare mythology. His Howard University shirt was on its last structural year, the fabric so soft and thin at the shoulders, it was more memory of a shirt than actual textile. His canvas sneakers were the same pair, the right toe still carrying the sapphire green paint stripe. The Chevelle sat on the concrete in the morning light. He had filled the bucket with hot soapy water and soaked the wash mitt and worked the hood first, starting at the center and moving outward in the methodical spiraling pattern that ensured even coverage. The same pattern he had been using for years. The radio in the open garage was playing Marvin Gaye, "What's Going On?", which had come on mid-album, and which Darius had not chosen specifically, but which, when it registered in his peripheral consciousness as he worked, seemed to be there on the particular terms of things that arrive at the right moment. The neighborhood around him was performing the specific domestic theater of a Saturday morning in late April. A father 2 houses down was attempting to edge his lawn with the studied concentration of a man who has learned that focus on the immediate task is the best available response to a hedge trimmer. A pair of teenagers on bicycles moved through the cul-de-sac with the unhurried ease of people with no were particular to be and a pleasant morning, which to not be there, from the direction of the Caldwell property. The mockingbirds were conducting their ongoing argument in the live oak with the cheerful combativeness that Darius had come to think of as part of the sound of home. He heard footsteps on the sidewalk, the particular rhythm of someone walking with purpose but not urgency, and he registered them without turning. Because the footsteps were familiar, Beatrice Caldwell moved, the way she had always moved, with the upright, grounded pace of a woman whose center of gravity had been settled in the same place for decades and was not planning to shift. She appeared at the edge of the driveway, holding 2 cups of coffee. No tray, no ceremony, just 2 mugs, one in each hand, brought the way a neighbor brings coffee to a neighbor on a Saturday morning. Morning, Darius, she said. Morning, Beatrice. He set the wash mitt on the hood, wiped his hands on his pants, and took the cup she offered. Strong, the way she always made it. They stood together at the edge of the driveway in the comfortable, unhurried silence of people who have said a great deal to each other over the years and understand that the present moment does not require filling. After a while, Beatrice said, "I submitted the written statement to the commission about the other stops. The 3 times on this street over the past years before yours, different officers, different pretexts, same basic situation." She paused. "I should have done it sooner. Each time I thought about it and I told myself it wasn't going to go anywhere and I put it off." Darius looked into his coffee cup. "It's not a small thing," he said, "to put your name on something and send it into a system that hasn't always made people feel heard when they did that." "No," Beatrice said. "But I did it." "Yes, you did," he said, "and the commission is going to use it. Voss's unit is building the full picture. All the stops in this area, over the past years, the dispatch records, the complaint histories, what you provided closes a gap in the pattern." Beatrice nodded. She drank her coffee. "Your car looks good," she said. "Thank you," Darius said. "Took some work to get back to this." It was true in more ways than the literal one, and they both understood that, and neither of them said so directly because it was the kind of understanding that benefits from being left in the air. The front door opened and Renee came out onto the porch carrying a plate of cornbread, warm hot from the smell of it, the particular warm cornmeal smell that had been moving through the open window since earlier, and that Darius had been aware of the way you are aware of things that belong to the texture of your life. She was barefoot on the porch boards in her Saturday clothes, reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead where they always lived on weekends. She came down the porch steps and across the yard and handed the plate to Beatrice first, and Beatrice received it with the expression of a woman who has been brought cornbread by Renee Holloway before and knows exactly what that means. The three of them stood together in the April morning in the driveway of the house at the end of Sycamore Court. The sun was fully up now, the light clear and direct, falling on the midnight green of the Chevelle with an intensity that made the paint look like something you could reach into. The chrome bumpers reflected the three of them in their curved, distorted way. Small rounded versions of Darius and Renee and Beatrice compressed into the convex surface of the metal. Standing together in a driveway on a Saturday morning that belonged to them, Darius looked at this car and then at the street and then at the neighborhood around him. In its April presentation, the lawns coming back to green, the oak trees leafed out, the particular quality of a Saturday that belonged to the people in it. He had declined the lieutenant promotion a second time. He had accepted the oversight commission, chairmanship, and had been at it for months. He had already identified 8 points in the complaint review process where cases like Barlow's could have been caught earlier, and had submitted formal recommendations on 5 of them that the board was currently reviewing. It was not glamorous work. It produced the slow grinding satisfaction of someone who is making something better by increments, who knows the increments are real even when they are not visible, who has decided that this particular work is worth doing because the alternative is to leave the structure as it was, and the structure as it was had produced Trent Barlow. Jamal asked about the commission, and Renee said, "He wants to come to the next public meeting. Tell him to come." Darius said, "We need people there." Beatrice finished her cornbread and handed the plate back to Renee with a thank you that was simple and genuine. She looked at Darius. "The neighborhood feels different this spring," she said. Darius looked around Sycamore Court. He considered this honestly. "Does it?" he said. "Lighter," Beatrice said. "Like something that was sitting on it isn't sitting on it anymore." He thought about that. He thought about the years of it, the stops he had been told about, the ones he hadn't, the people who had filed complaints and been turned away, the slow erosion of a neighborhood's relationship with the authority that was supposed to serve it. He thought about Jamal Kendrick, the teenager with the phone across the street last summer, who had sent a letter months ago saying he was applying to pre-law programs and that the morning on Sycamore Court had clarified for him what he wanted to spend his time doing. "Maybe," Darius said, "we'll see what the next spring looks like." Beatrice nodded. She walked back to her house with the particular unhurried pace of a woman who has somewhere to be and is taking her time getting there. Renee went inside. The mockingbirds resumed their argument in the live oak. Darius picked up his washcloth. He worked the Chevelle's passenger door in slow, even circles, the soap running off the curves in the clean, unhurried way of something that has enough time to do the job properly. The radio in the garage had moved onto something else, Aretha Franklin Respect, which hit the April morning with the specific, irreducible joy of a song that has never once suggested it might run out of reasons to be felt. The badge was in its velvet-lined box on the mantel in the front room. He had not surrendered it with his retirement paperwork. Retired officers kept their shields as a matter of departmental tradition, and Darius had folded it into the box and placed it on the mantel, not as a trophy and not as a monument, but in the way you keep something that represents the best of what you tried to be in a long stretch of complicated years. It was there on the mantel, alongside a photograph from his youngest daughter's wedding and a ceramic pitcher that Renee's mother had given them and a small framed card that his elder daughter had made him when she was 7 that said in unsteady crayon letters, "My dad is the best policeman," which he had kept for decades. Not because it was literally true, but because it was the truest thing he knew how to aspire to. He worked the mitt over the chrome of the rear bumper, the circles slow and steady, the soap lifting the remnants of winter from the metal. The April morning continued its quiet, generous progress around him. The child somewhere around the bend of the cul-de-sac was attempting the slope again with the training wheel bicycle, the aluminum frame scraping the asphalt in unsteady, determined arcs. And Darius listened to that small sound, the sound of someone practicing at something they have not yet mastered, refusing to stop and let it fill the morning alongside the Aretha, Franklin and the mockingbirds, and the smell of carnauba wax and the particular warmth of a Saturday that was from every available angle entirely his own. Trent Barlow had believed for over a decade and up to the moment a gold shield caught the afternoon sun in an Oak Ridge Heights driveway, that the badge on his chest was a guarantee that certain spaces were his to patrol, certain judgments were his to make, and certain people were obligated to yield to the authority he carried. He was wrong about every part of it, and the law he spent over a decade treating as a personal instrument became, with the indifferent precision of consequence, the exact instrument of his own undoing. Years and the permanent end of a career is what, over a decade of deliberate, institutionally protected predation, costs when it finally encounters a man with both the knowledge to name it and the standing to ensure it is named loudly enough to matter. Darius Holloway did not win because he had a gold badge in the pocket of his work pants. He won because he had the discipline to remain entirely himself in a situation designed to diminish him, the wisdom to understand that the point of the confrontation was not the confrontation, but what it could be made to build afterward, and the courage to stay in the fight long after the driveway, building the structure that protects the next person who does not have a badge to flash, and the person after them, and everyone who filed a complaint that was never heard. He traded a gold shield for a commission chairmanship and an oak desk for the slower, harder work of rewriting the rules that let men like Barlow feel untouchable for so long. If this story stayed with you, if the gold catching the light stayed with you, or Beatrice's coffee, or Barlow's voice on that second recording, or the sound of the baton hitting the concrete of a man's own driveway, tell us in the comments. What was the moment that got you? We read everyone, and if you want more stories where the truth finally gets the room it deserves, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. The next one is already on its way.